You leave a meeting feeling pretty good. There was clear direction, action items were assigned, everybody nodded, and then 2 weeks later, you realize everybody walked away with a completely different version of what was decided. Same meeting, same slide deck, totally different memories. The gap between we covered this and we actually remember this causes more team friction than almost any tooling or process problem that you could imagine. So today we're going to unpack why that happens and why alignment without recall is basically an illusion. What's up, UX fam? Welcome to another edition of the Cognition Catalog, where every week or so, we'll dig into a new cognitive bias and explore how that bias can impact how our team works together and what we can do to ensure we don't get caught up in the pitfalls. Because working with people is hard, and the more insights we have into the human condition make it just a little bit easier. To learn more about the testing effects, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell on there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these cognitive biases again. Shout out to this week's sponsor, Mobbin. If you're tired of staring at a blank Figma canvas, Mobbin gives you instant access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows with a library that grows bigger every week. Kickstart your creativity, streamline your workflow, and level up your design process. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. So this illusion of learning shows up in teams way more often than we like to admit. Most teams don't fail because they don't talk enough. They fail because they mistake talking for learning. Now think about how often this happens. A decision gets made in a meeting. There's a slide deck, there's a discussion, everybody nods along, and then it just quietly evaporates. 2 sprints later, somebody asks a question that assumes the opposite decision was made. Somebody else on the team references a constraint that was supposedly quote-unquote locked down, and then someone else says, wait, when did that change? But nothing changed. It just wasn't remembered. Teams fall for this phenomenon constantly during roadmap reviews, sprint planning, retros, and even onboarding. We overload people with context. We assume that exposure equals understanding, and then we move on. But memory doesn't work that way. Listening is passive. Reading is passive. And even agreeing is passive. And passive exposure gives us a dangerous illusion. We think alignment happened when it really didn't. Now, onboarding is one of the clearest examples. New hires will sit through days of reading through pages and pages of documentation, architecture overviews, process maps, user flows, strategy decks, training videos, and here's how we do things sessions. Now, everybody leaves feeling good, but a week later, that new hire hesitates. They ask the same questions again and again, or they avoid making decisions altogether, not because they weren't paying attention, but because nothing forced them to retrieve what they learned. The same thing happens in retros. Teams review what went wrong, they talk about lessons learned and capture action items, but unless those lessons are actively recalled later during things like planning or estimation or decision making, that team doesn't actually change behavior. The retro becomes just a ritual of reflection, not one of learning. Even experienced teams fall into this trap during complex projects. We assume shared context because we've all been around for a while, but over time, understanding starts to drift. People remember different rationales, different risks, different trade-offs. Alignment starts to decay quietly until it just blows up and shows up as rework or frustration or outright conflict. And this is where the testing effect becomes incredibly useful, not as a teaching trick, but as a team operating principle. So what is the testing effect? We tend to remember information better and learn more deeply when we actively retrieve that information from memory rather than just rereading it over and over. This phenomenon shows that practice tests and retrieval practice strengthen memory retention more than just passive study. It highlights that engaging our recall mechanism is itself a powerful learning strategy that enhances long-term memory. The roots of the testing effect go back to early memory research in the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of the earliest contributors was Hermann Ebbinghaus, and he studied how memory fades over time. His work on what he called the forgetting curve shows that information decays quickly without reinforcement. But what he didn't yet show, but helped to set the stage for, was how retrieval changes that curve. The testing effect became more clearly defined in the 20th century as psychologists began to compare different study strategies. Researchers noticed something counterintuitive. People who spent less time reviewing material but more time testing themselves often remembered more in the long run. And this challenged that common assumption that repetition and exposure were the best ways to learn. Modern research in the early 2000s, especially work by Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpik, solidified that idea. And their studies showed that retrieval practice, being asked to recall information without prompts, produced stronger, longer-lasting memory than just restudying notes over and over again. And even when people felt less confident during testing, their actual retention was higher days or weeks later. And what makes the testing effect especially important is that it exposes a mismatch between confidence and competence. Passive review feels productive, but it doesn't create durable memory. Active recall feels harder, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, but it's what actually builds understanding. And that gap shows up constantly in how teams think they've aligned until reality proves otherwise. Now, inside teams, the phenomenon quietly shapes what people actually remember versus what they think they remember. Teams exchange large amounts of information all the time through meetings, documentation, Slack messages, presentations, but without opportunities to retrieve and restate that information, much of it fades quickly or becomes distorted over time. And this shows up in day-to-day work when teams repeatedly revisit the same decisions. They forget why something was done a certain way, or they disagree on what they previously aligned on. And often, this isn't due to poor documentation or lack of attention. It's because the information was never actively retrieved after it was first shared. Passive exposure only creates familiarity, not durability. This also influences how shared understanding forms within a group. When team members explain ideas to one another, or they summarize outcomes from memory, or they restate goals without notes, they are reinforcing collective knowledge. And those moments of recall help surface misunderstandings early before they harden into assumptions that ultimately slow progress or create friction. So in retrospectives, planning sessions, cross-functional discussions, that retrieval naturally acts as a diagnostic tool. When people struggle to recall a decision or rationale, it signals that the knowledge was never fully integrated in the first place. Teams that normalize recall rather than treating it as a failure are better positioned to course correct and build more resilient shared understanding over time. And importantly, the testing effect highlights why psychological safety matters. Retrieval requires speaking up. It requires thinking out loud. And maybe most important, it requires being wrong. If team culture punishes uncertainty, people will start to avoid recall and they'll default to that passive agreement. And over time, all this does is create shallow alignment and hidden confusion that only surfaces when things finally break down. So how can you harness the testing effect in your day-to-day? Well, first, treat alignment as something that you verify, not something that you assume. Shared meetings and documentation creates the appearance of alignment, but recall reveals whether it actually existed. So asking people to restate decisions or constraints can surface those gaps early when they're easy to correct, rather than later when it gets even harder to fix. Next, design onboarding around explanation, not exposure. New hires learn faster and retain more when they're asked to explain workflows, decisions, systems back to the team. But make sure they know that you're not testing their competence. Reinforce that you're strengthening memory and confidence at the same time. Next, design team rituals that reward remembering, not just shipping. Stand-ups, planning sessions, retros, they can all support retrieval if they ask people to recall goals, assumptions, and lessons over time. When teams revisit and they restate what matters, they're not being repetitive. They're reinforcing the mental models that guide daily decisions. And next, normalize recall as a team habit, not as a performance signal. When recall feels like evaluation, people start to avoid it. But when it's framed as collective sense-making, it strengthens trust and shared understanding. Teams that practice retrieval openly reduce confusion, rework, and unnecessary conflict. And lastly, maybe the most important but probably the simplest, end meetings with prompts that require recall. So instead of ending a meeting by asking, "Does anyone have any questions?" which only invites silence, try asking, "Can someone summarize what we just decided?" or "What did we decide?" or "What should we remember from this?" That one question forces recall and instantly reveals whether alignment actually existed. And ultimately, the testing effect tells us something simple and uncomfortable. If people aren't asked to recall something, they probably won't remember it. And it's important to remember that correction doesn't require quizzes or formal tests. It requires intentional retrieval moments built into everyday work. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for the Cognition Catalog for today. I hope we helped to shed a little bit of light on the testing effect and how we can use it to impact our day-to-day work. But I'm curious, Have you harnessed the power of the testing effect in your daily work? How'd it go? I'd love to hear about it. Let me know what you think on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. To learn more about the testing effect, you can find more resources at cognitioncatalog.com and click the little bell down there so you get notified when a new episode drops so you never have to worry about falling for any of these biases again. And if you want to pick up some big, beautiful art prints of some select biases, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/shop. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the promo code YouTube to get 10% off your entire order. And if you have a favorite bias that you want to see in print, let me know. I'd be happy to take requests. And if you're tired of staring at a blank Figma canvas, Mobbin gives you instant access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows with a library that grows bigger every week. Kickstart your creativity, streamline your workflow, and level up your design process. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Roddy, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those videos right now for as little as $5 a month. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all.